so like Nate said, our goal today is to talk about disciplinary actions specifically. A low-key goal of mine is to try to come up with like trainings for all of these processes that we do that are sort of like this. So that's why it's called Living Out Our Vision and Values, and talking about how we do that in our policies and procedures. So the purpose and measurable outcome is, first, the purpose is of disciplinary action is to turn performance, attendance, and issues around by continuing to identify problems, causes, and solutions. We want to accomplish this in a way that embodies our values by training our leaders of its importance and process. So the outcome, hopefully, from this time together, we'll all have a clear understanding of the steps of coaching and discipline and the expectations in that process, and then the ability to access documentation and training outside of this meeting. So hopefully through this process, we'll all know and be on the same page. And then all of this will be on the intranet, so that way if there's any questions or concerns going forward, you can consistently refer back to that. And obviously I'm always available as well, but I want it to be accessible so you can own the knowledge. With that, here's our sort of 5-step process that we're looking at right now. The first being training, and we're just going to discuss that very briefly, because obviously in order to hold someone accountable, we have to know that they know the information. Then verbal coaching, what does that look like? When should that be used? How can we communicate? Written warnings, then our final warning, and lastly, what does termination or demotions look like, and how do we process that? So with training, again, we can't hold people accountable for things that they haven't been trained on. We never want to assume that someone knows something. So how we can do that is by asking open-ended questions, because someone can say, if I say, do you know how to do this? They can say yes. But if I say, do you know what happens if you do it like this? It gives them an opportunity to actually know the knowledge and respond back to it. So for example, what do we do when we've clocked out at home instead of the job site? Then they can repeat back to you, well, I would send in a time change request form, and I would say that I did the wrong location or the wrong time. That way we know that they know the process, rather than us just giving them the information, or asking them to describe for us what our cell phone policy is. A lot of the times they don't need to necessarily have all of the information memorized, but if they know where to access it, that can also be helpful. So they know, well, I'm not supposed to be on my cell phone at the job. Well, then we can refer them back to the employee handbook and say, well, on page 4, it says explicitly, this kind of information regarding your cell phone. So hopefully with our training, being able to do that, and then also correcting the moment. So if you notice, if you're noticing with your crews that maybe someone makes a comment about, oh, well, I forgot to do this with my time card, or, oh, it's not a big deal because of that. Feeling empowered and feeling like having our crew leaders and our operations managers be able to correct that issue right there in the moment. That is the biggest way to have an impact to ensure that going forward they don't repeat the problem. This is particularly helpful for our crew leaders because they're the ones that are going to hear conversation, right? They're going to be the ones that are going to know someone's going to make a comment about, oh, well, I clocked out and no one said anything. Well, the crew leader should be a leader enough to say, well, that wasn't the right way. Here's, we weren't supposed to do that. You need to do this going forward. So with training, obviously you guys are being on the field, are experienced a lot more in that, and hopefully we can just come alongside in whatever way. The next step after you've done training and ensure that they know what the process is verbal coaching. This is an undocumented, informal conversation. It's important with verbal coaching. This is an opportunity to correct the individual by assuming the best in them. So again, that's why it is more of an informal process. I talk with people like during orientation, and the idea that we're going to anywhere from, and I say here, it can happen once or multiple times. We may say one time, or we may say 5 times about an issue. It's really up to our discretion because it's an informal process. That depends on you as a leader, what you want to do in that. But you're going to also, how you go through that process with someone will probably be based on your training style and the needs of the employee. So like a stupid mistake, so to speak, of like, oh, I forgot to do something. Well, you may have an employee that's, a little bit more forgetful. So you may have more grace to repeat them in the direction for multiple times verbally, or maybe a big enough issue that you're like, hey, you didn't know that. Now you do. We need to make sure we follow that correctly. We want to emphasize the importance that if this is a problem after this conversation, that formal action would be taken. So it really is, like I said, an informal conversation that's just to try to help them recognize that this is something you did this is what you need to do, and this is what will happen next if you don't follow what you need to do going forward. Nate recommended like the idea of like the I messages. So being able to talk about like talking about how you feel in response rather than accusing a person. So when you continually show up late, I feel that the work and team aren't important to you or aren't important. And because you're late, it affects production. It makes us unable to have everyone on the same page for safety. We would prefer that you show up on time or 5 minutes early. Try to have sort of like, that's just an example of one way to have those kind of verbal conversations in order to coach well with that. And we'll do questions at the end in case anyone has any questions with it, so that way we can continue going forward for the video for everyone there. The next step after verbal coaching is going to be a written warning. This is documented only after you've done verbal coaching or if the offense is worthy of immediate documentation. The reason for that is that sometimes people may just not quite understand the weightiness of what they're doing, and to give them the benefit of the doubt and to assume the best in them, we want to give them the opportunity to have had a verbal like, hey, do you understand that this is a thing? And then after that, doing a written warning. Again, if the offense is worthy of immediate document, so if it's something that you know was trained and you know should have happened, then yes, you can go straight to this process. You need to have a disciplinary action form filled out and schedule a formal sit down with the employee and have one witness, specifically someone in leadership. So the reason for that is this. Micah and I are having, like Micah's going to have a written warning with me. We go sit down, just he and I can leave that conversation hearing things that maybe weren't being said, or I could come back legally and be like, okay, accuse Micah of doing X, Y, or Z, or being aggressive in what he was his presentation. The reason why he'd have a witness is just to prevent any kind of he said, she said situations. You want to have someone that's there, and also that way, if there are questions or if someone gets really offended, that you're not the only person that are trying to answer the things. Typically, the witness is not going to be involved with the process except for to sign on the document that they were the witness there, or if they feel like the part of the reason having a leadership is that way if they feel that there's something that that needs to cool down or anything gets escalated, they have the ability to speak into that. Leadership means basically anyone from crew leader up. The reason why you don't want to have anyone that's just like an employee is because they are peers. You shouldn't be having peers having to hold the other person accountable in a disciplinary way. So again, you're going to have it schedule a formal sit down. A sit down can be on a job site if it's out of the space of everyone else's work being done. We want to have it formally sit down because that way employees recognize what's happening. Part of the conversation I've had with previous employees and disciplinary action is they were saying, oh, I didn't know that that's what was happening. So we want to make a very clear and marking moment that they're having a formal conversation with a document filled out with a witness there to say, this is what's happening. This is important enough that we are taking the time out of our day to have this conversation with you. The supervisor, in filling out that action form and talking with them, must give the employee opportunity to comment and respond. So in the form itself, it has a section there if they want to fill it out. Some people may argue that they did not actually do the thing that was wrong. I've had that happen, where they will be like, oh, well, I disagree with your findings. What we come back and say is like, I understand that. You can write that in the comments here, and we'll have that on record, but we are still proceeding with the written warning. And that way they still feel like they were able to say something. You don't want to leave that meeting without having had them sign. So that way, if they're arguing with it, they can put their comments in there. And then if something were to come up in the future, we can refer back to that and make a decision at that point. The form is signed by all parties, a copy made for the employee if they want. So we always offer saying, would you like a copy of this? And then the form is turned into HR. The supervisor documents also on the coaching session form. So basically what we're dealing with is a physical form that you're filling out and printing out and giving to the employee. Then you're also doing just like a 5-question thing on Google Forms, just so we have that digitally documented so we can refer back to that a little bit easier and quickly versus it being in the employee file. The goal of the written warning is to present the weightiness of the issue to the employee and to lay out clear ways that the employee can improve and remain a part of SP. Well, so when we go through the disciplinary action form itself, it shows like what those goals look like, but that's the point of doing the written warning. Our final warning is documented only after a verbal warning or verbal coaching has occurred and written warning has occurred, or if the offense is worthy enough of an immediate documentation. We have to fill out, again, same with the written warning, a disciplinary action form and schedule a formal sit down with the employee and one witness. Again, we are giving them opportunity to comment and respond to the warning. It's all signed by all parties, a copy made, and we document it on the coaching session form. The difference, though, is that to present the weightiness and lay out clear plans and letting them know that if this behavior persists, termination will be the next step. So we've had this, this is important enough conversation with written warning that we needed to sit down, and then this final warning is anything else comes up, you are no longer working for us, and this is what we expect from you going forward. The goal with this whole process is to truly try to make it where people feel like we are working as hard as we can for them, and we're making it very clear what they have to do to meet us there. Finally, with termination. So after 2 warnings, a third violation would result in a termination. The supervisor would submit a request for termination to the HR department, and the employee in question would be suspended with a meeting scheduled within 3 business days with HR. If there is not proper documentation, it will be at the discretion of the DM and the HR representative to determine whether adequate coaching was given to the employee. All of that to say, it's important that we document everything that we do, because it gives weightiness to what we've done, it shows accountability in what we've done, and also it makes it where we can come back to the employee and say, no, look, we did this, this, and this. We are committed to you, we are involved in you, and we are willing to do as much as we can, but we've done those things, and you've chosen not to do them, and thus you're choosing to not be a part of here. Hopefully with termination, we're not just creating a situation where they feel hurt. Everyone's going to feel hurt. It's understandable. But they know that they were the ones that dropped the ball. We are not giving up on them. We're just holding them accountable for the things that we've already laid out. But we also understand that sometimes something may come up where proper documentation may not have occurred, especially historically. And thus it's at the discretion of the division manager and any assistance they want from the HR to determine whether coaching was given. Along with the termination request, the supervisor must also inform HR if there was any equipment outstanding that should be collected. That's a big part, is if someone had access to things or they were responsible for things, we need to know so we can request to that be turned in. And if they don't turn it in, to be able to take that out of their last paycheck, which is why within 3 days is when that final meeting is scheduled. That final meeting with the employee is they're given a disciplinary action form stating the reasoning for their termination and listing the previous actions that we've taken towards them. With that meeting, it's not to say that they aren't being terminated. So it's more to give time where we're able to suspend them so we can go ahead and do the HR department can go and look and see, okay, we have done our proper documentation, or this is the accusation that's being brought to the employee. So let's say someone is stealing time on their time card, and we know that that's an offense that needs to be terminated for because it's being consistent. HR needs time to be able to review this so we can present it to the employee to lay out exactly what happened. So that's why there's a 3-day gap there where you can just suspend them when there's that issue coming up, and then we actually go through the final termination process with them. Instant termination, there are certain times that and behaviors that won't be tolerated, and these are listed directly in the employee handbook as well. And so theft of company products or workplace equipment, assault of a coworker or customer, abuse of a coworker or customer, being under the influence or intoxication at work, and behavior that could jeopardize the health, safety, or profitability of other employees or the company. If an employee has any of these occur, the decision is made at the discretion of the division manager with consultation from human resources. So we are a small company. We have the ability to choose that we feel like we can invest more in these people, or we want to give people second chances, and we want to honor that process in our company while still having some level of accountability with it. So these are the things that everyone who works for us has signed this employee handbook to say that they agree that if these things happen, they know termination can occur. But what we're also saying is we're going to give ourselves a little bit of space to determine whether or not that action was something that should just be terminated immediately, or if we want to do another process in there. If we chose that from these behaviors we decided not to terminate, we would just go to a final warning in order to be able to hold them accountable to ensure that nothing would happen in the future. part of disciplinary action, oftentimes, especially in the growing population that we have here in Sioux Falls and just generally in the kind of work we're doing in construction, drug testing is something that we just need to be aware of as part of our process. So going forward, if we, like with drug testing, we will implement that after any kind of accident, whether work related or car related, that's like a worthy enough accident. Drug testing can also occur for just your empowerment to know that if there's abnormal conduct or erratic behavior or deterioration of work performance, we can request drug testing. And then direct observation of drug use and what like the effects of that, or if there's physical symptoms like slurred speech, agitation, being lethargic or uncoordinated or inappropriate responses to questions, we can do drug testing back according to that. South Dakota does not have any drug testing laws, but what we want to do is have consistency, so we're not ever able to be found, oh, you were only pinpointing a certain demographic of the population. So really, these are the things that we want to say if we're ever going to do drug testing, that these are the reasons why we are, that they fall into one of these three categories. And then if an employee is found positive, the decision is made again at the discretion of the division manager with consultation from human resources on what we're going to do and move forward with. Again, if we chose to keep them on, they would go straight to a final warning in order for their conduct to be taken seriously and hold them accountable to better actions in the future. So I do want to show you guys an example of the disciplinary action form. And what we have here is, this will be on the leadership intranet. We've talked about how to get this digitally. Right now, we're not going to have it digital, specifically for the reasons that I want to have the physical signatures of the employee, not just a digital one. Like, right now with most of our farms, it'll say like, oh, do you give your digital signature? Those aren't very really legally binding in the way that we'd like this to be. Having all of these procedures also just gives us a safety net to make sure that we're treating everyone fairly and kindly. So in the employee disciplinary form, you put like their name, their date, employee position, supervisor name, the division that they work in, and then the type of warning. So is this a written, final, or termination? And the italicized is to help you know what information to put in there. So for example, what happened? Describe the unsatisfactory performance that led to this action, trying to provide as specific of details as you can. So date and place are great. If not, being able to say, well, we know that this, giving as much specific as you can. So if you don't know the exact date, a time frame. It was the beginning of the week of, June 19th or whatever it may be. Who observed the behavior? So this is always a little difficult for companies to do. It's like, well, should I list the people who observed this happening? Because what if there's a fear of retaliation? What we found, from what the companies that I've worked for in the past, is that it's better to name the people involved and be very clear, so that way the individual knows that we know who was involved, so that actually can help reduce retaliation, if that makes sense. So if we don't list, then I'm like, oh, was Nate the tattletale? And so then all of a sudden I may act aggressively towards Nate, when in fact Andrea was the person who reported the issue. So that way we can make sure we're actually protecting our people by listing who observed the behavior. Impact, describing what the effect of the employee's unsatisfactory performance, behavior, or conduct had on the environment, and what we can do to and where it prevented us from reaching our full potential. And then how. The following are the two ways that every employee has to choose to grow and learn from the situation, to be more excellent, or to choose that this is not for them and to end their time at select painting. So when you're filling this out, you will still leave the italicized in there. Just to be clear, you would type in here, so I'd say, what happened and who and what, and all of those things. And you're going to leave the how, because that way they understand very clearly what's happening. So in order to move forward and continue with select painting, we call it growth. So how do they move forward? They do it by describing, we describe the expected performance, behavior, or conduct, and the expected time frame for them to achieve this performance. Or we also have the end. Basically what will happen is if you follow these certain behaviors or actions and do not choose to change, you are not going to be working at select painting anymore. And describing what the consequences are. So if it's a final warning, the consequences are that you'll no longer be working here. If it's a written warning, the consequences are that there will be a final warning. And just describing very clearly, like, so for example, if someone's not obeying the cell phone policy, then being able to say, if you continue to abuse your cell phone time while you're at the workplace, then it will result in a final warning. Being able to basically take the growth and inverse it to what the end could be. The goal with this form then also is to have employee comment section where they can write if they agree, disagree, did they have any comments on it, to feel like they actually have a say in what's happening. And then you have the manager signature, employee signature, and the witness signature. There's a little disclaimer at the bottom saying that they understand that this doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with all the content of it, but they understand that they are receiving this documentation regardless. Again, you can just come into situations where people can disagree with you, but that doesn't mean that we're going to change what we're doing. So with this form, it's hopefully to make it very clear and present for our employees to know what kind of investment we're making into them in their behavior and their actions, while also holding us accountable for that. So that is the end of my presentation when it comes to disciplinary action. I have, if anyone, yeah, you can clap, it's good. No, just kidding.